Yet much as the wain was diminished by the dragon engine that served it, so too was Mishra dimmed by his companion. She was a slender woman with hair the color of blood-stained rubies, dressed in dark clothes, a flowing cape billowing behind her. She carried a simple unadorned staff of black wood and seemingly did not recognize the crowd's shouts, for she kept her gaze forward. From Urza's description, Tawnos knew this must be Ashnod. Ashnod is most likely the most enigmatic character in Magic the Gathering's lore. While she is oftentimes mentioned on flavor text in several MTG sets, her only appearance in the books is in the first part of the Artifacts cycle, the Brothers' War, and she's briefly mentioned in the second part of the cycle when Urza discovers that she was in fact a Phyrexian infiltrator sent to corrupt his brother. Not that it wasn't already obvious from the plethora of hints that the first book gave out about this mysterious red-headed artificer. For those unfamiliar with how the lore was usually used in the early books of the Magic the Gathering series, it was very common to give out some minor details and hints that were grounds for speculation in the lore books for the sets that came out. Oftentimes those slight accents were casually addressed later in the story, and just as easily the subject would get abandoned completely. The perfect example would be Gerard and how he would survive falling from the sky with some trees and shallow water softening his impact, or how he was able to still hold on with a giant cyborg Spider-Woman clinging onto him. Then you would learn that he was the result of Urza's eugenics program that aimed to create a lineage of superhumans that was able to fight against the Phyrexians. It was similar with how the Brothers' War gave out hints about Ashnod's origin. If you paid close attention, there was almost always something off in a scene where Ashnod was involved. Details that didn't make much sense before learning their significance in part 2 of the series, The Planeswalker. Although in the second book of the cycle Ashnod is only mentioned briefly, it is when Urza informs Xantcha that he has discovered from his efforts to extract information from the time modes that she was in fact the first the Phyrexian had suborned. This discovery might have been a shock to some readers, except that there was a plethora of hints in the first book in the series that suggested that she might have not even been a human from Dominaria. In fact, the very first encounter with Ashnod is filled with questions that were neither addressed then nor answered later. She first shows up shortly after Mishra acquires the first Phyrexian dragon engine, and she's the one who helps the Zegonai defend against it. Although she was able to completely pacify the dragon with her invention, a staff made out of bones and copper wires, she decided to meet Mishra and inform him about it, then became his apprentice willingly, even though it's obvious that his artificing knowledge was at that point still far below hers. It is during that meeting in Zegon when we get a very subtle message about her origin. When Mishra points out that she isn't Zegonai, Ashnod defensively replies that he isn't Falaji either, and when he introduces himself as the Raki of the Suwardi, she simply replies with,
"I'm Ashnod, of nothing in particular."
It's also during that conversation when she casually explains basics of Phyrexian biocybernetics to Mishra. A very peculiar Ashnod moment occurs when things go south during the Warlord meeting and the massively obese Qadir Mishra is serving becomes wounded by Urza's android. In the chaos, Ashnod goes out of character and simply grabs the large man with one arm to drag him to safety. Another moment of realization comes from the discussion Ashnod is having with Tawnos after he asks her where she got the knowledge to build her staff from. Ashnod doesn't answer that question but instead proceeds to explain in detail her understanding of artifice. At some point she even describes the process of Phyrexian completion to him. At that moment it became obvious that Ashnod did understand a completely alien concept of artifice deemed impossible to even the assistant of Dominaria's most renowned artificer. There is a very peculiar scene where Gix ponders about his need to take care of the only two beings that actually matter something on those lands. The first was Mishra, who stole Gix's dragon engines from Phyrexia, and the second one was, surprisingly, not Urza. It was Ashnod. He does mention Urza as a person of interest later, but only because he holds the other piece of Glacian's Power Stone. Gix seems to be deciding on the severity of the punishment, and points out that Mishra, unlike Ashnod, is a thief, so she would be spared. Later on, when Gix has his priests working as agents, they first focus on making Ashnod's life miserable. One of the priests conducts an investigation against her after she's helped Tawnos escape, which leads to her being banished by Mishra. Ashnod was sure that they did it because they wanted access to her knowledge and laboratory, but considering how the priests had no will of their own and only followed Gix's orders, they had no need for it. It was her punishment for an unknown transgression to Gix, which was carried out. As the brothers' war nears to an end and Ashnod comes back to aid Mishra in his final battle, Gix himself shows up to the scene, and the person he pursues is Ashnod, not any of the brothers. She addresses Gix as a demon, which is the exact same term Zancha uses in the second book for the first Phyrexians. It was also then when Gix commends her for getting stronger, when she uses her staff on him. It was obvious at this point that they have met before, and not just during the short moment when Ashnod and Mishra ventured into Phyrexia to steal the dragon engines. This is the last scene where Ashnod is present, and from that point onward we have no idea what happened to her. We do have several hints. The first is in the first book itself, where we have a description of the heavily wounded Gix coming back to Koilos, covered in human blood. Who was powerful enough to have wounded him when all the machines were controlled by Gix? And whose blood was splattered over his body? That was probably meant to be a cliffhanger for Ashnod's return later, that seemed to have been completely left out. Another hint is the card Tawnos' Coffin. The first book mentions events from every major card from the Antiquities set, especially the artifacts. Tawnos' Coffin was a machine that let a person hibernate unharmed, and in the book allowed Tawnos to survive the Silex blast and stay in stasis for several years until Urza found him by accident. Who's that on the card's illustration lying inside the thing? Why, that's Ashnod. But let's leave the speculations there unless we need Urza's tinfoil hat soon. Who was Ashnod then? She couldn't have been a Phyrexian creation like Zancha, as Gix's nudes were short and androgynous in their early versions. They all looked the same since they were clones. Zancha looked nothing like Ashnod. So, was she a human from Dominaria then? Also highly unlikely. She would have been at least somehow augmented to allow her inhuman strength she exhibits during the clash with the warlord, and it would also explain how the only feature that has changed in her over the years was a few strands of her hair turning silver, even though she should have been somewhere around the age of the brothers, or only a bit younger. We can read of this kind of augmentation when Gerard receives Yawgmoth's boon in Apocalypse. What about information in the second book? It doesn't really shine more light on Ashnod's background. She was confirmed to be the first person working for the Phyrexians, with the motes of time during Urza's investigation. That was when Zancha tells the Planeswalker that it makes no sense to her considering it was Ashnod who gave Urza the Silex, to which he shuts her up saying that using the motes of time only shows fractions of events that happened but they are never wrong. Was she working for Gix and then betrayed him, or maybe there was a different demon involved? A far-fetched theory would be that she was sent to infiltrate for Gix and originally recruited from the humans on a different plane than Dominaria. In the later books we learn that there are whole planes that serve as a beacon between others for Phyrexia, like Mercadia for example, or Wrath. Ashnod was possibly from that nowhere in particular she mentions early in the book. Nowhere on Dominaria. Did Ashnod survive the blast? When Urza came back as a planeswalker years after the events on Argoth, he thoroughly searched for any trace of her still being present on Dominaria. It seems to have been a high possibility to him, so we might assume that she didn't perish in the blast. A likely scenario would be that she was still somewhere at Argoth, in one of Tawnos' stasis coffins. Perhaps after Urza found Tawnos and released him from the stasis, Tawnos was able to locate Ashnod and do the same? Or perhaps Gix was faster and brought her to Phyrexia? With the set called Brothers' War coming out soon, there's so much potential for continuing the story of Ashnod. Perhaps we'll get surprised, perhaps disappointed with how the set's lore handles Ashnod. If you found this video helpful, hit the like button. Tell me who was your favorite character from the Brothers' War era in the comments down below. Have an amazing day and catch you in another video.